your life is on the line and you know that you're on an oxygen tank and they're going to put two in your head, see what you do. Because the bottom line is that me, I'm one person. I can never miss.
Guy's not being loyal to you. How could you be loyal to him?
Yeah.
And whether you're your father or not. So, you know, but it's always been hard because it was my father.
The word came down, this guy had to go. You know, we didn't know nothing about him until the last minute. And I liked him. I liked Billy. He was a nice guy, but...
Welcome to the show.
Or at very least are non-political, and you wouldn't know if they were or not. Hey, what's up? This is Mooch, and you're chatting with Staxx.
Welcome to this episode of Chatting with Staxx. I'm your host, Bill Staxx, and today I got Mooch, right?
Mooch.
So welcome to the show, man. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on Chatting with Staxx. So how you doing, man?
I'm happy to be on, man. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. We've been wanting to get this done for quite a while. I remember when I first saw you, I think you were still involved with the club back then, right? Were you?
I was probably just recently out because it's been just over a year since we've been talking. I've been out coming up on 2.
So we're going to get into your story. Before we get started, make sure you guys hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell so you can get my videos every time they drop. So do you want to tell the people, where were you born and raised, and what was your childhood like?
Yeah, I was born in Salem, Oregon. It's about an hour south of Portland, which is a big city out there. I was born an identical twin. So I was born and raised with my twin brother. So I always had someone with me to do what, hanging out, partying, whatever. I mean, from family trips to getting involved in motorcycle clubs and going on trips, I always had somebody with me. But, I have a middle-class family. It's pretty much all school teachers. And so I grew up playing sports. Most of my uncles and grandpa were all athletes and high school sports coaches. So I grew up wrestling and playing all the sports, mainly focused on wrestling after junior high. And yeah.
When did you first notice motorcycles and all that?
My biological dad was into Harleys. And before he went to prison, he rode quite a bit. He rode with some of the local clubs, but was never in one. So I'd spend my weekends with him. So I remember, bikes out front, bikes coming and going. But I didn't really start riding until I was like in my early 20s. I grew up in the punk rock and skinhead scene, and we were riding like Vespas and other stuff. And one of the older homies got a Harley and talked us into riding it. And I went on one trip with him, and one ride around the block with him, and that was it. I was hooked. So my brother and I went out and bought some bikes right away, and I've been riding ever since. I think my first bike was in 2005.
Was it your goal to get in a motorcycle club when you first got a bike?
No, I was still doing the skinhead thing. I was in a kind of a neighborhood skinhead gang and wasn't really interested in motorcycle clubs. The ones in my area, they weren't any. The Gypsy Jokers were the big one, which if you know clubs, people know that name. But we didn't have like Hell's Angels or Mongols or anything like that. And a lot of them were really old school cats, from a kind of a different era. So coming from like that punk rock skinhead scene, there wasn't like a lot of allure to that crowd yet. It was a lot of older guys. They had some sick bikes and real traditional old school club, but it wasn't anything that had drawn me into it just yet. So I was still kind of just doing my thing. I was still playing in a band and touring, and me and the guys would ride, and we'd meet up and go to concerts and stuff. But we hadn't really thought about clubs yet.
So was it you or your brother that gravitated towards the club first?
That's a good question. I think it was me. So, I was reading all these different books about motorcycle clubs, and I actually had read Under and Alone. And one of the guys from the skinhead gang I was in, he was from LA, and he had known some dudes from that skinhead crew down there that had joined the Mongols. And so he had told me that, hey, I know some guys that joined that club. And so it kind of clicked to me that, there was that connection from punk rock and skinhead and the hardcore crews that kind of went into motorcycle world. Because like I said, in my area, I wasn't really seeing that. So I became pretty interested in it, and I started reading any book that was out there about clubs. And, you know how that stuff goes. It was kind of pre-internet or early internet. So, you know, I was trying to look some stuff up, but really you had to like meet people and go to stuff. And so my girlfriend at the time worked at the local Harley dealership, and one of the members of a Portland club called the Outsiders had worked there. And so I had met him from going back and forth to the dealership a lot. And he invited us to hang around, or, you know, just come out, hang out, meet the guys. And so I brought it up to my brother, and we just started showing up.
Oh, and that was the club around that area at that time. And
Yep,
were they?
Yeah,
were
yeah.
they
There's three clubs in that Northern Oregon area. Well, four mainly, but in Portland it was, you know, the Outsiders, which had been around since like the late 50s, early 60s. They were one of the first clubs in Portland. They didn't claim 1%er at the time. They do wear a 1%er diamond now, but at the time they were, you know, local club. They had 2 chapters in the Northwest, and they were like a really old school, tight knit club. You couldn't have a store-bought bike. Everyone had to have choppers. And then Brother Speed was a bigger one. They're like really big at the Northwest, and they were out of Portland. And then the Gypsy Jokers, who are a 1%er club, and they've been around, I think, since the 40s or 50s. They started in Northern California, moved up into Oregon and Portland. So there was a lot of old school history there, but not and the Jokers, I guess, can consider to be national club, but, you know, as far as like any of the big 5 and stuff like that, those weren't in our area.
Did you have any situations happen to you when you were involved with the skinhead movement? Like, were you involved with fights? Were there things going on like that at this time?
Growing up, things were pretty crazy in that scene, right? It's a pretty violent scene. We fought against the neo-Nazi skinheads in our scene, and in Portland was pretty well known for having a lot of like white power skinheads. And so there was a lot of clash, you know, especially at concerts. And it wasn't like it is now where like people were going to rallies and protesting on TV. Like, we'd catch each other in the streets or at concerts. But yeah, you know, it was pretty violent on and off, and even between other crews. So there was a lot of things that kicked off at the time too. I was in a band for 5 years during that time, and I toured all over the country. So I met like a lot of dudes from other crews and other gangs, and, you know, really did a lot of networking and getting to know other people from that skinhead scene too. So, you know, that was a big benefit to that time in my life, because I spent so much of it on the road.
A lot of people might not even know what you're talking about. When you say the word skinhead, people have this perception of what that's about. Can you explain what maybe you guys believed in back then? What, like you said, you guys were fighting this other faction of the skinheads. Can you explain what skinheads are so people out there can know what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely, because that comes up a lot. So, you know, the traditional skinhead movement, you know, started in England, but it was a huge emphasis and heavily influenced by like East Indian music. So Jamaican music, reggae, soul, rocksteady, that type of stuff. And it really started out as a subculture, you know, that was into music in a certain fashion sense. So just like, say, punk rock or emo or anything else, it was a group of working class kids that listened to a certain style of music and dressed a certain way. And then, you know, in the 60s, 70s, and actually into the 80s, they started getting into, you know, a lot of media coverage. And a lot of that was from like what the soccer hooligans were doing on national TV, and a lot of politics that were going on in England. And because, you know, of the look at the time, it's kind of funny to think about now, but having a shaved head back in those days was like a pretty bold statement. It made you a tough guy, you know, and so at the time they were getting a lot of media, you know, there's a lot of media about these tough local guys, and they were getting a lot of coverage. And so the different like political groups were using them for their own advantage. So because they looked tough and they were street tough guys and they were fighters, a lot of guys from, you know, right-wing organizations were using them as security. And by bringing them around, they kind of got into that scene. And so it didn't take long before, you know, people were putting the connection between white power and skinheads as like the same thing. And by the time it came to the United States, that's kind of what most people knew, right? From all those Geraldo shows and all those things in the 90s, was that skinheads were synonymous for racism. And it really wasn't. So, you know, there was the traditional skinhead faction, which was all the guys that like that style of music, that's, you know, the fashion, you know, the camaraderie, all the cool stuff that comes with it, but weren't into politics. And then there was like the far left dudes they called themselves sharps. There were skinheads against racial prejudice. They fought against neo-Nazis. And then obviously there was the Nazi side of it. So there were kind of different factions within it. But it all came from the initial subgroup. So the majority of traditional true skinheads aren't racist at all, or at very least are non-political, and you wouldn't know if they were or not.
See, a lot of people might not even know that type of thing, you know?
Absolutely.
When you say the word skinhead, people are like, oh, well, that's a racist organization. They can't
differentiate. Yeah, especially in the United States, you know, it was really big, you know, in the United States. It was in the media here a lot in the 90s, and it was all, you know, related to racism and racist stuff. So I think in the United States, that's what a lot of people think.
They had suspenders.
Yep.
They would wear shoelaces in their boots, like red shoelaces, right? If they stomp somebody out and all this stuff.
Yeah, different crews did different things, but yeah, that was one of the popular ones for sure.
So, what was your first interactions with the motorcycle club? Like, did you get invited to a event? How did it play out for you? And was your brother there for the ride?
Yeah, so I met that guy at the Harley dealership, and he was in that club, The Outsiders, and he invited us out. And the first few times he just invited us out with him and one other member, probably wanting to get to know us, he didn't want to vouch for us and bring us to the clubhouse and have issues pop up or whatever. So, he spent some time getting to know us. And the more time we spent like riding with them and hanging out, we eventually got invited to the clubhouse and hanging out. And then we started to hang out with the guys more and supporting their events and parties and functions. And it just kind of naturally started kicking it more and more till we got to know the guys a little bit better.
And did it feel like a brotherhood when you started to hang out with these guys?
Man, it did. But, one of the realizations I had is, I was pretty naive to this stuff. So I was almost like starstruck, right? I'm like, whoa, this is a motorcycle club. This is crazy. Like, this is all the stuff I grew up hearing about. And a lot of these dudes were they were a lot older than me. They had a lot of history in that scene and they'd done a lot of things in their eras. And so I was just kind of like trying to take it all in, and it was really cool. But one thing I noticed, like once I settled in and got comfortable and was really starting to get to know everybody, is yes, they were definitely a brotherhood. They were very tight knit. But I didn't feel like I was one of them. Like I said, these guys were older guys that listened to a lot of classic rock, and even though I really enjoyed hanging out with them, they didn't seem like the type of people that like I'd hit up on a Friday to come over or go hit a barbecue or go watch a movie with. We were just kind of a different era or different generations. And it kind of occurred to me that if it wasn't for that patch or that club, I wouldn't have much in common with these guys. And that was one of my first real big realizations into that world or that scene, where if I were to join a club, I wanted to make sure that it was something where like, these are people I'd be friends with or without this patch.
Yeah. So you feel like kind of like you were an outsider for them, right? So then,
yeah, I was a younger guy. I was a younger guy, came from the punk rock scene. We had different upbringings, just kind of, different views on life, like different generations. I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, I respected the hell out of the dudes and I think they're awesome. So I don't mean that in a negative way by any means, but they just, we weren't the type of people I would usually kick it with.
Yeah. I mean, they've been hanging out with each other for years, right? They're in this motorcycle club. They have this bond. When you come around, it's kind of like, do you feel like that sometimes when you first get there, right? So what I want to know is, what's it like to prospect for the Mongols?
So I prospected for the Outsiders, but I never prospected for the Mongols. I was actually given a patch to the Mongols. I came in a time of the Mongols where, if anyone knows much about the Mongols, Doc was in charge. He was on this big like national recruiting campaign and was trying to get a bunch of members really quick.